It is day one of Christmas vacation for President Trump. So far, he spent his first day off golfing at his private club in Florida. CNN shot this exclusive video of him setting up for a putt. The holiday break comes as the president celebrates a major victory. Just 24 hours ago, he signed the Republican tax bill into law. But even then, when the president had every reason to brag, he didn't talk for long. You see, unlike past presidents, Trump did not hold a year-end news conference to tout his accomplishments, something that hasn't happened in 15 years. Instead, he took a few questions before reporters were ushered out of the room. Today, though, we're learning that's not what President Trump originally wanted. We're actually told his aides argued against it, fearing he'd be asked questions about the Russia investigation. CNN's Boris Sanchez has all the details. He is live in West Palm Beach, Florida, right near Mar-a-Lago. So, Boris, what can you tell us?
Hey there, Pam. Yeah, that's right. Advisors apparently talked the president out of holding this year-end in-depth news conference with reporters out of fear that he would be besieged by questions about the Russia investigation and other distractions. The White House certainly dealing with a distraction right now and responding to this explosive New York Times report about some alleged insensitive comments that the president made about certain nationalities during a meeting about immigration with top officials. The White House refuting all of the New York Times reporting, but this is certainly not something that the White House wanted to be talking about just one day after the president signed the tax reform bill into legislation. They were expecting to be taking a victory lap right now. They wanted an uneventful vacation. We were told that the president was expected to start focusing on his State of the Union address, which is scheduled to be delivered to the nation before the end of January. We were also told that he was going to start weighing his options when it comes to the next steps in his legislative agenda. There are two options essentially on the board for the president. One would be to dig in on entitlement reform, on welfare reform, something that House Speaker Paul Ryan has said is the next logical step following tax reform, or potentially something that he talked about before departing for Mar-a-Lago yesterday in the Oval Office before reporters, an infrastructure plan. The president actually admitting that his legislative agenda might have moved much easier ahead had he gone for infrastructure first, because in his words, that's a bipartisan issue, somewhere that Republicans and Democrats can find common ground. Despite all of that, the White House is now having to respond to this, again, explosive New York Times report, something that we will likely hear about again and again in the coming days, Pam.
And those sources of the New York Times requesting anonymity, the White House putting out a statement saying some officials on the record denying that, but the New York Times, you just interviewed the reporter for that article, and they are standing by their reporting. Boris Sanchez, thank you so much. The FBI uncovers a terror plot planned for the Christmas holidays. Details on the target and...
They're moving forward with Cosentix.
Go to this tweet that James Comey, the former FBI director, put out this morning. He said, sadly, we are now at a point in our political life when anyone can be attacked for partisan gain. James Baker, who was stepping down as FBI general counsel, served our country incredibly well for 25 years and deserves better. He is what we should all want our public servants to be. You know, so that, of course, raises the question, James, why was he reassigned? I'm told through sources that he was reassigned to be a part of special projects in the FBI. We don't exactly know why. And, of course, a new FBI director is more than welcome to come in and bring his own leadership in and move people out. But do you think this could also be a result of a concerted effort by Republicans to undermine the investigation and those leading it?
Sure, and Pam, moving aside from the politics for a second, just to unpack this for your viewers, processes and protocols in the FBI. The FBI has been around for 110 years. There have only been 8 FBI directors. Obviously, the one right now is Director Wray. Each FBI director is entitled to pick his own senior staff. Yeah. They're going to move folks around. They're going to pick their own deputy director and their own chief counsel. So James Baker served as the head of OGC, the Office of General Counsel for the FBI. So he wasn't per se Director Comey's or Director Wray's or Deputy Director McCabe's personal attorney.
Although he did work closely with James Comey.
Very closely with him, and certainly he'd be the guy that would be called in for questions about investigations or cases or how to proceed. Now, he's been reassigned. You could take that two ways. The Republicans are going to certainly harp on this and say it's because, you know, he's got a lot of baggage. The Democrats are going to look at this and say it's a political angle to try to cast shade on the FBI. So once we sort through all that, I think it's going to be interesting, because if he ever decides to become a private citizen because he's been reassigned and he could certainly retire and go somewhere else, he could be called in front of any of these congressional subcommittees and asked to testify about conversations.
It certainly seems, though, from James Comey's tweet that he believes that this happened because of politics.
Sure.
And, the New York Times reported that Wray was under pressure from President Trump to reassign people who were close to James Comey. Can you see an FBI director giving in to the pressure from the president on something like this?
No, I listened to every second of Director Wray's confirmation hearing, and I believe him. I don't know him personally, but I've talked to a number of agents that worked with him when he was with the Department of Justice. He's a guy who's going to chart his own course. I think what he's done is a couple things. He's kind of reined certain things back in. The FBI's policy now on communicating with the media per se has been kind of tamped back down the way that
Tell me about it.
I'm sure
As
you're
someone who covers the FBI.
Absolutely. So, and I think that's part of the response to the fact that Director Comey had a much more open and garrulous, relationship with the media, and I think that they're trying to do that. The leaks are unconscionable. I have great respect for Director Comey. His probity is unquestionable and unimpeachable. But he's guilty of a leak, and that's something I think that they're going to struggle with.
Guilty of a leak, you mean the memo that he gave to his friend who then leaked to the New York Times?
Through a surrogate to the New York Times, yes. So, we have strict rules about that when we're working within the FBI, and for the director to have engaged in it, people
at that point, he was the former director.
That's very, very true, but people have argued that, that's something right now that the FBI is dealing with. Are people leaking? Are people in sensitive investigations leaking? And that's something that nobody wants.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Carrie here because, Carrie, we heard three similar accusations from the president's son and two sitting members of Congress this week. Take a listen to this.
My father talked about a rigged system throughout the campaign, and people are, what are you talking about? But it is, and you're seeing it. There is, and there are people at the highest levels of government that don't want to let America be America. They don't want to let the little guy have a voice.
I think they were putting together a plan to stop Donald Trump from being the next president of the United States. I think it's amazing, in spite of the fact that the Democrats were against him, the Republican establishment was against him, the mainstream press was against him, and now I believe the FBI and the Justice Department were against him.
We've had this investigation about Russian collusion. Maybe we need an investigation about high-ranking Obama officials colluding to try to prevent Trump from being president. That's more serious than even Watergate.
Well, in the face of all that, Carrie, as my colleague John Berman pointed out to Jim Jordan, if the FBI was trying to prevent Trump from being president, then why did James Comey wait until after the election to acknowledge the investigation looking at his campaign and possible coordination with the Russians? That aside, is it reasonable to think that there is some sort of coordination between the White House and members of Congress to undermine this investigation's credibility?
It sure looks that way, Pamela. And I want to go back for a second to what Jim was talking about and with respect to the tweet that you put up from former Director Comey. I've known Jim Baker, the outgoing FBI General Counsel, for almost 20 years now. And there really is nobody who represents a greater level of public service and dedication to the country, particularly after the years after September 11th. And so what we're seeing in some of those clips that you played from Republican members of Congress, from Donald Trump Jr., is just part of what is happening that I just can't remember ever seeing before, which is members of Congress, those involved in the political space, who are verbally attacking and going after individuals like Jim Baker, like Jim Comey, like Andrew McCabe, who have dedicated their lives to public service and protecting the country. It's one thing to have politics over issues or politics in the context of an election, but this targeted attacks against particularly the FBI and individual senior officials in the Justice Department who are charged with enforcing the law and protecting the country is really just out of the bounds.
And, it is interesting. I mean, Robert Mueller, of course, is also the subject of these attacks. When he was first appointed special counsel, he was lauded on both sides of the aisle as being an independent prosecutor. And now, as we see, the tide has turned against him as well. All right, Carrie Cordero, James Gagliano, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Well, the president spending his first day of holiday break. What else? Golfing and celebrating a major victory on getting tax cuts signed into law. We'll take you to his Florida Golf Club just ahead. You are live in the CNN newsroom. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I was about to read to you the statement, but let's go now to CNN's Boris Sanchez, who is joining us from near the president's resort there in Florida, where he is golfing today. So what more, if anything, is being said from the White House? Boris.
Hey there, Fred. Yeah, this started off as a relatively quiet, uneventful vacation for the president. And after the publishing of this explosive New York Times article, the White House is now having to spend their first full day here at Mar-a-Lago refuting some of the claims made by the New York Times and some of the explosive comments that were attributed to the president through the New York Times' various sources. Again, the White House denying that the president made those comments very strongly, providing to CNN the same statement that they provided to the New York Times. Sarah Sanders writing, quote, General Kelly, General McMaster, Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Nielsen, and all other senior staff actually in the meeting deny these outrageous claims. And it's both sad and telling that the New York Times would print the lies of their anonymous sources anyway. Clearly, the White House not wanting the focus to be on this reporting by the New York Times at this point. You'll recall that earlier this week, just yesterday, the president signed into legislation this major tax reform bill, something that he admitted that he would have preferred to have a large signing ceremony, a public signing ceremony for, but he opted to do it quickly before Christmas as a symbolic gift to the American people. We also learned yesterday, sources telling CNN, that the president wanted to have an end-of-year news conference, but that he was ultimately talked out of it by advisors who feared that the president might be besieged by questions about the Russia investigation and other distractions. This certainly classifies as another distraction for this White House to deal with at a point where they were feeling victorious about the tax reform bill. So we will see just what kind of an expanded response we might get from the White House following this. But as of right now, what we have is the statement from Sarah Sanders refuting all of the New York Times reporting, Fred.
All right. Boris Sanchez, thank you so much there in Florida. All right. A warning from Russia to the U.S. Why the Kremlin is concerned about new U.S. sanctions pertaining to Ukraine. Welcome back. A just-released New York Times article reports on explosive details of a June Oval Office meeting about President Trump's aggressive immigration agenda. In the article, the president is accused of making several inflammatory statements about immigrants. The Times article, citing 6 officials who attended or were briefed on the meeting, details the president was visibly upset about immigrants flooding into the United States despite his campaign promise to fortify the nation's borders. Venting to his national security team, the president reportedly began reading from a document given to him by domestic policy advisor Stephen Miller that listed how many immigrants received U.S. visas in 2017. And according to one of the officials who attended the meeting, according to this New York Times reporting, the document read that and I'm quoting now from how it's written out of the New York Times, Haiti had sent 15,000 people. And the president is being quoted here as saying, they all have AIDS, he grumbled, according to one person who attended the meeting. And then in this meeting, apparently, it was also mentioned how many had come from Nigeria. And I'm quoting now how it's written from the New York Times. 40,000 had come from Nigeria, Mr. Trump added. Once they had seen the United States, they would never, quote, go back to their huts in Africa, recalled the 2 officials who asked for anonymity. Now, I want to bring in one of the reporters, Michael Shear, of the New York Times, who helped break this story. Michael, good to see you. All right, so this meeting, now already Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the spokesperson, you had reached out to, and according to the article, Sanders is saying this didn't happen. So how did this come about? Do you have sources who either heard of, were in attendance of this meeting, who are giving you these quotes of how the president reacted to these things?
Right. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. My colleague Julie Davis and I both cover the White House, and we spent the last several months actually working on a very long piece about the president's immigration policy throughout the entire year. So we tried to trace from the beginning of the year, which started with the travel ban, all the way through a lot of the different pieces of immigration policy that the president has tried to implement, a lot of which have been aimed at securing the borders, making sure that people don't come into the United States. As part of that reporting, we talked to several people who described this meeting, in which the president came into the Oval Office, had a lot of his national security team there, and was essentially complaining, this is about halfway through his year in June, complaining that the steps that they had taken so far hadn't done enough to secure the borders, to keep people out, that people were still flooding in his words, as too many people coming in, and that they posed potentially a threat and other problems. And it was in the course of the reporting for that meeting that we talked to people who described how the meeting went and what the president said, and that, as you described, that he read from a list of countries and how many people were had come into the United States from those countries. And that's when he made sort of derogatory comments, first about the Haitians, and then about the Nigerians and others. And so, we're confident. We stand by our sourcing. We're confident that story is true. The White House did push back very aggressively late last night and early this morning, sending us a note that said that several of the cabinet secretaries who were in the meeting at the time say that it didn't happen. Not that the meeting didn't happen, but that the comments, the inflammatory comments weren't said. But we stand by our reporting, and I think, would encourage people to look at the entire story, because there are many, many different aspects to this story. It's a long piece, and it talks not just about this meeting, which I think is emblematic of his approach on immigration, but also kind of about the rest of the year and all the different things that the administration did.
And you also write in your reporting that there's real consternation that apparently it elicited quite the emotional response from John Kelly, who is now Chief of Staff. At the time, it was Secretary of State, also Tillerson, Rex Tillerson, who was in the meeting, or at least listening to the comments from your reported comments from the president, as well as this documentation. But that seems to really underscore some real fissures, too, in how they were handling what you are reporting to have happened in that meeting.
Right. I mean, this was essentially the president and most of the national security apparatus that deals with this issue, that deals with immigration and border control. And there was, it was described to us as very heated and a lot of back and forth, a lot of crosstalk. And at one point, Mr. Kelly, General Kelly, who's now the Chief of Staff, was then the Homeland Security Secretary, and Stephen Miller, the Domestic Policy Advisor, really did sort of gang up on Secretary Tillerson, whose State Department, of course, manages the sort of entry into the country. That's the Consular Affairs Division of the State Department. And so there was a lot of tension. At one point, Secretary Kelly said, sort of looked around the room, realized there were other aides in the room, and said, we should clear the room here if we're going to continue this conversation. And at that point, many of the more junior folks left, and it was just the cabinet secretaries who remained to continue the conversation with the president.
So this almost indicates, too, in reading your article, that, the real differences of approach were apparent even then, particularly with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson kind of being on the outside of how he was digesting this kind of information. It almost sounds from this article that if taking offense is too strong of a language, that he seemed uncomfortable with this kind of response coming from the president, as you report it.
Well, look, this ultimately wasn't a piece that was designed to look at the question of the fissures inside the administration. There's been a lot of other reporting, my newspaper and elsewhere, about the differences between Secretary Tillerson and others on the president's staff and the president himself. So this wasn't the idea of this article wasn't to sort of get at that, but it's certainly true that what was true about that meeting was that there was a lot of frustration, a lot of raw emotion, or a lot of raw feeling. And what we document in the rest of the story is that it took a while for the president's staff to kind of figure out how to maneuver the levers of power in government to get the things done that he wanted to get done on immigration. And so what didn't work as well at the beginning of the administration, we all remember the chaos of that first travel ban. When you sort of get to the end of the year, he's reduced limits on refugee entry into the country. He's ratcheted up enforcement and deportations inside the country. And so you get this sense that regardless of what the disagreements and divisions were among some of the key players, by the end of the year, the administration really has done a more effective job at implementing this sort of restrictionist agenda, this sort of keep people out agenda, which is what the president really wanted to do when he came into office.
Yeah, and we've talked about Nigeria and and Haiti, but also on the issue of Afghanistan. That was also something that was discussed, and you're reporting it here. More than 2,500 were from Afghanistan, a terrorist haven. The president complained. That's how you have it written in your article. But give me some detail on how the 2,500 number from Afghanistan was part of that documentation that was either being read to in some part and also the president reading, and what his response meant.
Well, so one of the things that was said back to the president during that meeting, according to our sources, was from Mr. Kelly and also Mr. Tillerson, was, look, these numbers that you're seeing on the paper, Mr. President, are largely, they're not indicative of threats. They're an overall number of people coming into the United States from those countries. So that could include, like in Afghanistan, it could certainly include, people who had worked with the American military as translators, or people who had relatives.
So arrangements.
In the United States. And so they were trying to say to him, look, don't take these numbers and think, wow, all of these people are threats. But it indicates the level of frustration on the president's part that even just a number on a page triggers in him a sense of like, hey, we're not doing enough to keep the country safe. And they would argue that that's what the president, what his motivation here is to try to secure the country against threats. We've seen, some of the attacks that happened in the last couple of months, the one in New York City and what have you. So their argument would be, look, this is what angers the president, is that, we're not doing enough to secure our borders. And that what this meeting shows is that sometimes comes out in very raw ways.
And this was the White House spokesperson, Sarah Huckabee Sanders' response to your reporting, saying, quote, General Kelly, General McMaster, Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Nielsen, and all other senior staff actually in this meeting deny these outrageous claims. It's both sad and telling. The New York Times would print the lies of their anonymous sources anyway. And also in your reporting, you mentioned that there were people outside of the room, but they could hear the sentiments of the president, and that he seemed enraged.
Well, so he was clearly angry, according to the people that we talked to, both who had been in the meeting, but also who had been briefed about it. Just to clarify, the folks, when we referenced folks that had been moved out of the meeting and were outside, the meeting at one point, as I mentioned, did get cleared out of some of the other staff members. We're not suggesting that they could hear through the closed door the specifics of the conversation, but once they were outside and the door closed, they could clearly hear that the conversation remained heated and was ongoing.
Okay, Michael Shear, it's a fascinating read. Thanks so much for joining us with the New York Times. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you very much.
And we'll be right back.
For Christy Paul.
And I'm Victor Blackwell. Good morning to you.
Now, the president is starting his morning at his golf course. He's celebrating after Christmas came early in the form of his first major legislative win, tax reform.
But this end-of-the-year high could be overshadowed by new developments in the looming Russia investigation. The president wanted to celebrate the win with this traditional year-end news conference, but his aides told him not to. Now, the House Intelligence Committee began questioning Trump's longtime assistant over the meeting between Donald Trump Jr. and the Russians back in June of 2016.
All of this may be making Republicans nervous as they head into the 2018 midterm elections. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is reportedly concerned about losing both the House and the Senate to Democrats.
Our new this morning, Senator John McCain released a statement supporting the president's decision to provide Ukraine with anti-tank weapons. Here's the statement. President Trump's reported decision to provide Javelin anti-tank munitions to Ukraine marks another significant step in the right direction and sends a strong signal that the United States will stand by its allies and partners as they fight to defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity. Well, this decision is years overdue, he says.
The president's move comes amid escalating clashes between Ukrainian soldiers and the Russian-backed separatists. Joining us now, CNN legal global affairs correspondent Elise Labott. Elise, Trump also just allowed Ukraine to buy weapons from U.S. companies.
That's right, Renee. And look, what they say is that these anti-tank munitions are considered lethal weapons. But what the U.S. says, and this is what the State Department said in a statement last night, is, these weapons are considered defensive in nature because they're not going after someone. The Ukrainians are defending their territory, and that's why, these anti-tank missiles can puncture the kind of armored vehicles that the Russians use. Now, we had some new reaction from the Russians this morning. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rubikov, in a statement, said that this action is going to create new bloodshed. Let me read a little bit to this statement. The United States, in a certain sense, he said, had crossed the line, announcing the intention to transfer weapons of direct damaging action to Ukraine. American weapons can lead to new victims in our neighboring country, to which we cannot remain indifferent. And so, a lot of people are afraid that this could be a pretext for Russia to launch new attacks, new strikes into Ukraine to try and further its grip on the country, Renee.
Elise, I think it's important also for people to remember how we got here. I mean, U.S. Officials have been standing in solidarity with Ukraine, but there has, for years since the annexation of Crimea, been this question of, to what degree do you allow the Ukrainians to defend themselves with this lethal and non-lethal weaponry? And now this is a major step. I think that the punctuation from Senator McCain points that out.
Right. And I mean, this is the first time we're looking at this kind of lethal weaponry. Again, the U.S. calling it defensive in nature against Russian aggression. President Obama did allow what President Trump allowed earlier this week, is for the Ukrainians to buy American-made light arms. You see that shoulder-fired missile right there. Some of those are considered light arms. Sometimes those are considered, and like small ones could be considered anti-tank missiles. But look, the U.S. has had a bit of a dilemma over the years, because clearly there is Russian aggression in Ukraine, but they've also been looking for the Ukrainians to make certain reforms of their own. The Ukrainians are not completely without some concerns about human rights violations and such, and there's been a concern about further escalating the situation. But apparently, and officials have said, this has really weighed on President Trump. And I have to say, for all of the criticism of President Trump, that he was going to bow to the Russians, that he was going to recognize Crimea as Russian territory, that he was going to lift those sanctions. That never happened. This is, in fact, a stepping up of, a tougher policy towards Russia, it seems, if you look at the actual actions that are taking place.
All right, Elise Labott with us this morning. Elise, thank you so much for breaking that down for us. The FBI says a terror attack has been averted in San Francisco. A former U.S. Marine is accused of...
I'm Michael Smerconish in Philadelphia. We welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. Merry Christmas, everybody. We know what the president wants for Christmas: credit from all the media for all of his achievements. He tweeted, "Sadly, the fake mainstream media will never talk about our accomplishments in their end-of-year reviews. We're compiling a long and beautiful list." Well, Mr. President, stick around. I'm about to talk about your impact. Plus, with 750 million packages delivered by UPS this holiday season, a growing number are being stolen by so-called porch pirates. I'm about to talk to a man who has figured out how to fight back with a bang. Plus, did you ever talk about something on your phone and suddenly start seeing ads for it? Is it a coincidence? Or are our smartphones spying on us? And a look back at some memorable moments on both sides from 2017, including everybody's favorite blooper by yours truly. George Papadopoulos. I know, I'm a dope. But first, we're almost 1 year into the Trump administration, and the end of any year is a time for assessing, especially this one. Mike Allen had an interesting observation this week in his Axios newsletter. He pointed out how little President Trump and perceptions of him have changed in the last year. Think about it. Roughly the same number of people support him today as did at the beginning of his administration. The Russian probe has remained constant. The elected Republicans remain skeptical of his leadership, but largely compliant. The elected Democrats, they still don't like him. The war with the media has never subsided, and neither have his Twitter fingers. All true.
But there's a temptation in those observations to conclude that his administration, the passage of the tax bill notwithstanding, is static, gridlocked, that nothing's getting done in a polarized climate. That would be a mistake. In fact, if the pace of change continues for the duration of Trump's presidency, however long that might be, I think he could become the most consequential president in the modern era. Consequential meaning most important and significant, having the biggest overall impact. As with the criteria that Time magazine uses when determining its Person of the Year, this is not necessarily a good thing. Think about it. A Supreme Court position that was by rights a Democratic pick instead went to Trump. And his influence on shaping the federal judiciary is far greater than just Neil Gorsuch on the nation's highest court. He broke a Senate record this year by confirming a dozen new U.S. Circuit Court judges, the most during a president's first year in office in more than a century. At the rate that he's going, by next year, more than 12% of federal cases heard will be by Trump-appointed judges. Those picks will be his longest-lasting legacy. The tax bill that he's just signed is the first major overhaul of policy since the Reagan era. Whatever the effect, that won't be undone anytime soon. And by ending the individual mandate, President Trump has felled a major domino that will upset the economic viability of the Affordable Care Act. After all, how can you provide coverage for those with pre-existing conditions if you don't have everybody in the insurance pool? Trump has made cutting federal regulations a priority. He's revoked 67. He's delayed or derailed more than 1,500 others. He's pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, okayed the Keystone Pipeline, recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and refused to recertify the Iranian nuclear deal. On his watch, the Iraq prime minister just declared victory over ISIS. The New York Times' Ross Douthat called it a war Trump won. In immigration enforcement, ICE has arrested more than 100,000 people who entered the U.S. illegally, 70% of whom were already convicted criminals. His State Department has undergone massive restructuring and shrinking, again, for better or for worse. And don't forget about the influence that ideologically driven members of his cabinet are having out of the spotlight. Betsy DeVos at Education, Scott Pruitt at the EPA, Ben Carson at HUD, Rick Perry at Energy, Jeff Sessions at Justice. No, Time magazine got it wrong when not naming the president its Person of the Year in 2017. By their own definition, the person who most affected the news and our lives for good or ill and embodied what was important about the year was absolutely Donald J. Trump. Joining me now to discuss Douglas Brinkley, he's a presidential historian and history professor at Rice University, and Larry Sabato, the director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. Larry, he's getting lots done, but without popular support. Can that continue?
I doubt it. Look how difficult it was to get that tax bill passed, and he never could get Obamacare repealed. I know about the individual mandate being abolished, but that's not the same thing as abolishing Obamacare. And this was with a new presidency, usually coming with some kind of honeymoon, Republican majorities in both houses. I grant you, thin majority in the Senate, but still, most new presidents with a majority in both houses get a great deal done. I would say that while certainly Trump has accomplished some things, and I agree with you on the judiciary, he could have accomplished a great deal more if he were a different kind of president. I don't know about being the most consequential, but I'll tell you this, he's the most different president in the modern era.
I think everybody could agree on that, including the president. Douglas Brinkley, there's a lot to be said for that which takes place through inaction. Differentiate between action and inaction and what it means for this presidency.
Well, just take a look at what you said, pulling out of the Paris Accord. Yes, he did that. What does that mean in the end? And it means that Donald Trump's turned his back completely on climate change. What history may show is the overridingly important issue of our time. I mean, we've having unusual wildfires, hurricanes, glaciers melting. The planet is really alarmed right now, and Donald Trump decides, it doesn't exist. I don't want to believe and listen to the scientists. So by that very inaction this year, we're losing momentum. We're not educating the society on what to do to make some changes with climate change. I just picked that one. You could go all over and see, you know, he's gutting the Environmental Protection Agency by 33%. Okay, you could save some money right now, and you're also make a little money, mining and leasing the public lands. What does that mean long term? What does it mean 100 years from now when we start just willy-nilly, desecrating public lands for gouging quick gain profits? Conservation is always about our children's children. So there's a lot that went on this year that I don't think is going to shine well in history. It'll be remembered for Charlottesville, Pocahontas, NFL issues that divide the nation on race and identity.
You know what occurs to me, Larry Sabato, is that everything that Douglas Brinkley, the historian, says might be true, and yet it will be seen differently in different ends of the country. For example, the laundry list that he just rattled off of the negatives will be embraced by the 46% who put him in office.
Well, you're probably right about that, at least most of the 46%. Remember, he has dropped somewhat. He's in the mid-30s. Maybe you could exaggerate it up to 40 based on the fact that the polls often underestimate his support. But he has lost support. Why is that? Because, as Doug was suggesting, he is terribly divisive. Instead of trying to bring people together, and this is not an era when you can bring people together, but he could have won a few percent more. He could have won over some people who were kind of in the middle about him to begin with. Instead, because of what he has done and because of the way he does it, Michael, he has divided people, I think, more than at any time since perhaps the last year of Richard Nixon's presidency. That is not a good thing. It is not a good thing that we are now truly the divided states of America. Red states over here, blue states over there, and oddly enough, those purple competitive states, they're also choosing up sides.
Gentlemen, is it possible to put this in some historical perspective? I want to show you what the president said yesterday, and then, Douglas, I'll ask you to respond first. Roll the tape.
Legislative approvals, for which I'm given no credit in the mainstream media. Harry Truman had more legislative approvals than any other president. We beat him on legislative approvals, for which I get no credit.
Historian Douglas Brinkley, he references Harry Truman. Who comes to your mind, if anyone?
Well, look, just Harry Truman created the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Security Council, the Pentagon, the Department of Air Force, the Secretary of Defense ship. I could go on and on. What did Donald Trump create this year? What is he going to be remembered for? I mean, John F. Kennedy, in his first year in office, Michael, did some bold things. He said, we're going to put a man to the moon by the end of the decade, and he started getting money put into states like places like Huntsville, Alabama, and Houston, Texas, infrastructure money on technology that worked with the space program. Kennedy created his first year the Peace Corps, Alliance for Progress. What's Trump known for? All over the world, he's seen as a bully. That's the net takeaway at the end of the year, and perhaps a bigot. And so it's very hard to see why history is going to be shining a great flashlight on a president with a 35% approval rating, the lowest since polls have been taken, whose big home run was a tax bill. That doesn't really excite people. It is a success at the end of the year, and he did get Gorsuch in, but it's been a very rocky first year.
Dr. Sabato, I think what he's achieved is that which he said he was going to do, which was largely, for better or worse, to reverse Obama-era policies.
Well, you're correct on that too, Michael. Let's talk about what that means, though. When you base your presidency around your base, your party base, and you are unable or incapable of bringing some people from the other party in the long run, that means the same thing is going to happen to Donald Trump. What karma that's happening to Barack Obama? Obama's presidency is being deconstructed piece by piece. Trump and his appointees are pulling out by the roots Obamacare's policies and regulations and programs. Look, at some point, I don't know when, is it 2020, is it 2024, can't tell you, but at some point you will have a Democratic president, a Democratic Senate, a Democratic House again. And I can almost guarantee you that the Democratic base will insist that the Democratic president and Congress do the very same thing to whatever is left of Trump's legacy.
Can I just say as a final word to both Douglas Brinkley and Larry Sabato, I worry most about a crisis. Knock on wood, we've really not had one in the first year of his watch, and I worry about what happens in a very polarized setting in one of those moments when in another time we would most certainly rally around the flag. Happy holidays to both of you. I really appreciate your expertise. Perfect guests for today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Michael.
What are your thoughts? Tweet me at Smerconish. Go to my Facebook page. I will read some responses throughout the course of the program. What do we got, Catherine? Can you give the Trump bashing a break? Why not point out the positive facts versus negative opinions? Smerconish. Tricia, are you blanking me? Like, that was the most, I wrote every word of it myself. That was the most even presentation of what this year has been that you will find anywhere. That's not an MSNBC view. That's not a Fox view. That is a straight down the middle assessment of, for better or worse, here is what has just transpired. And it gets frustrating for me for people who hear what they want to hear what they think they hear, and just don't listen clearly. One more if we've got time for it. Your pan of Trump was discussed. See what I mean? This shows your true preferences. I mean, Rajiv, can you please get together with the last tweeter and maybe the two of you can work it out? It's remarkable how people hear the same thing and just take away from it different conclusions. Up next, it's peak package delivery season, which means porch pirates are in full thievery mode. But one man hopes to thwart them in an explosive new style. Is it wrong that I laugh every time I
exercise rooms and swimming pools?
The Hispanic Caucus and DACA recipients, activists as well, are reeling after Democrats postponed action on the DACA program for the third time this year. There was no fix in the September short-term spending bill, no fix in the 2-week spending bill that passed on December 8th, no fix on the spending bill on Thursday before the government ran out of funding. Democratic leaders insist they have a strategy to pass a DACA fix in January. However, will they deliver on the promises, though, and when? Here with me to discuss, CNN political commentator Maria Cardona and chairman of the National Bar Association, PAC, and former D.C. Democratic Party chairman A. Scott Bolden. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning, Victor.
So let's start here, Maria, with what we heard from Minority Leader in the House, Nancy Pelosi, earlier this year in November.
I'll have to see what the spending bill is, but I fully intend that we will not leave here without the DREAM Act passing, with a DACA fix. And I've made that very clear.
We will not leave. Well, they left and it didn't happen. Explain how this is not a promise broken here.
Well, first of all, let's remember that Democrats do not control Congress. They don't control the House. They don't control the Senate. Exactly. They have very limited leverage.
But she knew that when she said it.
Sure, but what she was doing was certainly pushing not just Democrats, but Republicans as well. Let's remember there are many Republicans who have also made the promise to fix DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, for almost 1 million kids who came here through no fault of their own, who now, thanks to President Trump, who, took that protection away from them, are now in limbo. And so what she was voicing, which is still the case today, is that protecting these dreamers, as we call them, is a huge priority for Democrats, is a huge priority for American voters. And the hope was that Republicans would also make sure that this was a priority for them. We know that many of them support this. There is a bipartisan bill in Congress right now that if Republicans had the political will to put it on the floor right now, it would pass overwhelmingly with bipartisan support.
There's also Jeff Flake who said that in voting for the tax cut that he got some confirmation that there would be a DACA fix as well. So there is bipartisanship in the Senate as well. Let me get to Scott because I don't have a whole lot of time here. Sure. But this obviously is something that has bipartisan support, as Maria pointed out and we pointed out in the Senate. But if Republicans say yes, there will be a DACA fix, there will be protection for these roughly 800,000 undocumented peoples in this country who came here as children, no fault of their own, but we want money to start building this wall. Is that a fair exchange?
It's not a fair exchange, quite frankly.
But should Democrats take it?
Well, if the Democrats what? I'm sorry.
Should Democrats take that deal?
Of course not. They ought not take that deal because this has bipartisan support if they can get it to the floor. And remember, this isn't over. January 19th is when that spending bill is up, and they'll have to do another take. And Schumer has given a commitment to 17 or 18 Hispanic members of the House, as well as some others in the Senate, that they're going to lay the law down, or they're going to lay down the law on this. But this is about political capital. And the Democrats are committed to spending political capital on this. There's some Republicans as well. And remember, the backdrop of all of this is 2018.
Hey, why doesn't he show his birth certificate? Genimo, CNN.
God bless Trumpy Bear.
New York.